Tina, 2024 was always going to be an eventful year for political leadership. Today we want to cover some of the most important elections happening this year or just on the horizon. We're also going to try and cover our watching brief on developments in the Middle East and Ukraine. But before we go there, we need to talk about Trump and that felony conviction. Is this the bombshell that it seems to be? Can Trump still be the nominee and return to the White House? What do you think?
It's almost difficult to know where to start. I mean, what my response watching the verdict live from the courtroom in Manhattan, or live on TV rather, from the courtroom in Manhattan was, of course, we always knew that a conviction was possible, and yet it was still a shock to actually see it handed down, convicted on all counts, jury by his peers, the way the American system is built to happen. Trump has been able to shrug off so many extraordinary charges. He's been impeached. He's in a number of civil trials, but this was the first criminal conviction. And I do think that when a development like this that's unprecedented materializes, we do need to review our priors.
You initially also said you thought that Trump was unlikely to be issued with a custodial sentence in the end, but your latest note, you changed your view. Why is that?
Well, it's important here to make clear that I'm not an expert on U.S. law, and so my revised view is based on the politics surrounding this extraordinary development. I didn't address your question about whether Trump can still run. Yes, he can. He can still run. He will still be confirmed as the nominee at the Republican Party conference in Milwaukee in July, and he can still win. The drafters of the U.S. Constitution didn't address this directly, I would have thought, because it's just simply too difficult to imagine that a convicted felon would be in the position of running for the White House, and yet here we are. So going back to the point about why I've reconsidered my view that Trump was unlikely to be issued a custodial sentence. Well, if you look at the case on its merits, former President Trump has a clean criminal record. He's never been convicted of a crime before. He's 77 years old, which is a factor in the judge's sentencing decision. And this is a white-collar crime. Remember, this was a case of business fraud in effect. And so with that in mind, and not to mention the political pressure that the judge will find himself under, to do anything as dramatic as issue a custodial sentence, meaning involving jail time or even a suspended sentence, would be a genuine bombshell, to use your words. But let's look at what has transpired since that felony conviction came down on Thursday night. First of all, the Trump campaign and the Republican Party fundraising committee have seen, well, in the first 24 hours, saw $52 million in donations. So without a shadow of a doubt, this conviction has galvanized Trump supporters and boosted the fundraising outlook for his campaign. Am I suggesting Trump would do anything as brazen as exploit the felony conviction for the benefit of his campaign? Well, let's remember that this is someone who has been selling branded golden sneakers, Trump branded golden sneakers. So I'm being a little bit flippant, but there is no question that that Trump is able to and intends to make the most for his campaign. He's compared himself to Nelson Mandela and to the recently deceased Russian dissident Alexei Navalny. And so he's attempting to liken himself to political prisoners and political dissidents. Do I think Trump wants to go to jail? Absolutely not. What I'm suggesting, though, is at the sentencing hearing, which takes place on July 10th, just a few days before that Republican convention. I doubt that Trump will show the level of remorse that is expected of someone convicted of a serious crime. And if past is prologue, he's also going to struggle to find the self-control needed to not tweet about witnesses and jurors, to not complain about the jury trial, etc. And I think he's going to put the judge in an extremely difficult position.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on. We're going to move on from Trump, as much as I'm sure he wouldn't want us to. In the past week, both South Africa and Mexico have just had historic elections. The Indian elections are still ongoing. What should business leaders be watching for in these broader elections?
Well, if you know anything about this year, you know that a lot of very large populous countries are going to the polls. The numbers are in the billions of voters eligible to cast their vote. First big election cycle since COVID. And in both Mexico and South Africa, we've got two countries that were effectively under one-party rule for a very long period of time, and two countries that have seen violence, unfortunately, mar elections in the past. They're also both fast-growing and systemically significant countries. Foreign investors pay a lot of attention to what happens there, and so I flagged both of them as being significant for business leaders, particularly in a global environment where allies with the US and important countries from the point of view of growth, demographics, etc., really matter. So these two countries both fit the bill. So what do we have so far? Well, in Mexico, it's a bit more straightforward. We have a winner. The winner of the elections is a 61-year-old former mayor of Mexico City and a renowned climate scientist. Her name is Claudia Sheinbaum, and she will become the first female president of Mexico. And what's more is that even if she hadn't won, and her closest competitor had, we would still have had a female president in Mexico. This is extraordinary considering that women didn't get the vote in Mexico until 1953, so a few decades behind the United States, which of course is Mexico's biggest trading partner. But moving on from that to what businesses will be most focused on in this election, Sheinbaum succeeds her mentor, known as AMLO, and given what we know investors tend to be concerned about, there will be some focus on the likelihood of a left-wing populist agenda. The way that Sheinbaum herself puts it is building the welfare state, building opportunities, and taking on the drug cartels. And so that is something that is a drag on the Mexican economy too. So if she's successful on that front, then that would certainly be a huge boost to Mexico's prospects. So for Mexico, we have an historic election, a decisive election. I think she got around 60% of the vote, but also somewhere between 20 and 30 candidates for local councilors were actually killed during the campaign process. So that issue of drug cartels and violence really is a significant one when it comes to Mexico. South Africa, an earthquake has taken place. The ANC, which has held power with a majority since the end of apartheid in 1991, has seen its support fall below the 50% threshold that is needed to govern without a coalition partners. And so in the wake of that, we've got 2 weeks that are going to see, I think, a lot of volatility in the South African market and for the Rand as the ANC casts about to find its coalition partners. They have until around about June 18th or 19th to decide that. But the crucial point here will be the prospects for the Democratic Alliance, which has run the Western Cape fairly successfully for some time, if they're included in the coalition, or if one of the new offshoots of the ANC or some of the hard left elements end up having more potential. It seems like in so many of the elections we're talking about this year that the stakes are high, that we're at an inflection point. But for South Africa, in terms of its post-apartheid trajectory, I think that is really the case. So we're going to be watching those polls closely to see what the composition of that coalition is like and what the future of some of South Africa's kind of best known stalwart leaders, what we'd call the big beasts in UK political parlance.
Thank you, Tina. And just focusing a little bit closer to home, the EU parliamentary elections are coming up relatively shortly. And of course, we had our snap July the 4th date announced by a very drenched Prime Minister recently, too. What can we expect there?
Well, more sedate, I think, in both cases, maybe a bit somnolent in a certain respect, but nevertheless, important contributions to our outlook for political stability, for regulation in particular, for the EU case. EU elections never move markets. They don't see much voter turnout. You have the populations of the 27 EU member states able to go to the vote. So why am I even flagging them? A couple of reasons. First of all, they tend to be an opportunity for fringe parties, and remember that most European Union countries have parliamentary systems and not presidential systems. So they're a chance for smaller parties, newer parties, fringe parties to kind of have a go, test out their campaign platforms. And with that in mind, they give us a sense of the kind of palatability of their platforms ahead of national elections. If there's one thing we should be grateful for this year, it is that neither France nor Germany have got national elections. What we'll see, though, with EU parliamentary elections is how these non-mainstream parties actually fare. And with that in mind, the conventional wisdom for EU parliamentary elections is a sharp turn to the right, and I think a broader kind of tent on the right wing. And so we're also seeing some reformulations of the parliamentary groupings. The outcome of European parliamentary elections will also tell us who's going to occupy the most important posts. And again, if we invoke Elon Musk's rather unkind formulation that the US innovates and the EU regulates, that's what really matters for business. So who does best in these elections, who gets the prime posts for the commissioners that matter, and what it tells us about the next round of elections to come. I do think that sharp turn to the right will be something worth watching closely.
And do you think we have the opposite of a sharp turn to the right happening in the UK?
Yes, our own home country is an outlier in so many ways. We're not only among the lowest growth countries in the continent of Europe, even though we're not in the European Union anymore, but barring a truly extraordinary reversal of fortune, the UK's Labour Party is heading for something between a landslide and a supermajority. Now, I'm always cautious about making such dramatic pronouncements, but we have a couple of points on our side. One is the proximity. July 4th is only a few weeks away. Another is profound irritation, I think we can say, of the British electorate after 14 years of Conservative Party rule. There is just a kind of reflexive anti-incumbent sentiment that tends to take hold. There have been some pervasive and fairly snarky rumors that Rishi Sunak is keen to get his kids to California, where he'll join Nick Clegg, the former head of the Liberal Democrats, who's now at Meta. We leave that in the realm of rumor and snark, but there isn't much more that Rishi Sunak can roll out at this point. Governments like to give stuff away. There isn't a lot to give away. The cupboards are bare. Um, Tax cuts are going to be very difficult to fund. The costs of the disastrous Liz Truss government continue to rack up. And then a final point, because we've been talking about the left, the populist left, and what business leaders and market participants like to see. They don't tend to want to see a party on the left that has labor as its name. And yet, after my 22 years of living in the UK, I don't think I've ever seen the City of London so relaxed and even hopeful about a Labour government coming in. And I think that goes to show you a couple of things. One is the frankly, the centrist orientation of both of these parties, and also the hope, belatedly, that after Brexit and what it hath wrought, that a change in government might lead, especially to a better relationship with the European Union, and kind of narrowing some of that distance and even acrimony that we saw after Brexit.
Thank you, Tina. And finally, in terms of the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, you have advised that both of those are likely to be protracted in the past. But what I want to ask you is, are we about to see a change in that trend?
Well, President Biden would certainly like to see his recalcitrant ally, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, accept the ceasefire agreement that he has pretty forcefully tried to put forward. And indeed, Netanyahu himself is also coming under massive domestic pressure. Again, huge demonstrations, because for the Israeli public, the priority has been the return of the remaining hostages as a precondition to any kind of a ceasefire. There, just in the last hour, while we've been preparing for this, there have been conflicting headlines about this ceasefire. Over the weekend, there were headlines that Israel was going to accept it. We saw a lot of the usual kind of diplomatic language from Hamas and from Israel, saying it was interesting, and this sort of hedging. I think that Netanyahu will have a hard time buying more time and avoiding accepting this deal. But as we have said consistently in our analysis of the situation, when the war ends, when the Israeli offensive into Gaza ends, Netanyahu will be facing calls for his ouster and new elections. And that's what accounts for this friction. So let's put it this way. I think the prospects for a ceasefire are nearer and better than they have been for some time. But I would not be surprised if this particular juncture they fell apart again.
And just to pick up on Ukraine finally.
Yes, I mean, after months of delays in the U.S. Congress over passing the financing bill, we're starting to see the effects of that, the positive effects of that U.S. military aid to Ukraine trickling through. The question is whether it's too late. And so there has been fierce fighting in eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv, which is near the territories that Russia claimed after the Crimea annexation. And to make a long story short, after much ado and much toing and froing, there has been a significant change in the White House stance on how Ukraine can use its weapons, because it has been barred from attacking Russian targets. And the objective of this kind of set of maneuvers that's underway from the Ukrainian government is clearly to make it very difficult for Russia to hold that territory. And as you've heard me say before, the period between now and US elections in November is going to see fierce competition whether it's in conflict, or overt conflict, or in gray zone and below threshold actions, to increase the amount of territory and the amount of control that combatants have, particularly between Russia and Ukraine, but also between China and Taiwan and the Philippines, and these sorts of maneuvers, because the objective will be to strengthen their hands going into potential negotiations, especially if there's a change in government. So I think this will be a hot and contested summer, even if it's still raining in London.